In our first video segment on structure, we'll be looking at what many authors speak of as a three-act structure of short fiction. Chicago author Joe Mino was the first writer I'd heard speak of short fiction as taking place in three acts. We may think of this structure as belonging more to drama than to short stories, but many authors turn to the three-act structure in their short fiction. Simply described, Act 1 can be considered the introduction. The author introduces the reader to the conditions, the situation of the principal character or characters. The reader is located in the story. We know the characters, the setting, the tone. In the first act, both the acute and the chronic conflict are introduced, if not delved into deeply. An acute conflict suggests something that is timely, new, perhaps sudden. It's the immediate conflict, the conflict at hand. The chronic conflict, by contrast, is the deeper conflict, the conflict beneath, the conflict that has been long in development, most likely having taken root before the opening of the story. Act 2 is the arena for real conflict, confrontation. The protagonist is going through all the stuff here, facing the complications, the confrontations, the disconnections that drive the story. Act 3 is the conclusion. A lot of writers call this the resolution or denouement, but oftentimes those words suggest that things are going to be all tied together and resolved. All the conflict and disconnections and confrontations and complications of Act 2 don't always get resolved, though. And the best of stories, at least for me, there's never a neat resolution. Rather, the conclusion should hint at, but it probably won't resolve the acute or the chronic conflict of the story. Let's look at Kevin Brockmeier's The Ceiling through the lens of the three-act structure. First of all, most authors don't call our direct attention to the three acts by labeling them. We might get a hint at the acts because the author gives us a bit of white space between sections. Some writers will put an asterisk or a bullet point or a dividing line of some sort in there to call our attention to the acts of his story. But Brockmeier doesn't give us a single white space in this version of The Ceiling. No dividing lines or bullet points or asterisks. Act 1, of course, begins with the first line of the story, and this one is gorgeous. There was a sky that day, sun-rich and open and blue. The good stories reveal themes to us from the first lines. The language here, there was a sky that day. It surprises us on our first reading. It pulls us right into the story. Of course there was a sky that day. Why wouldn't there be? Having read the story, though, we know that power of the opening line, because by the end of the story, there is no sky. There's no sun. Nothing is open. Nothing is blue. There's no raft of silver clouds. There are no robins or sparrows calling from the trees. There are no trees. There are hints even from the first paragraph at both the apparent and the deeper subject. The terms apparent and deeper subject are often interchangeable with the acute and chronic conflicts in the story. The apparent subject, or the acute conflict, is that a ceiling is slowly descending on the world. It begins on a night in early summer with what looks like a square of perfect darkness against the full moon. And day by day it descends until it is no higher than a coffee table, covering, if not the world, at least the world of the narrator. This descending ceiling is a metaphor for the deeper subject, or the chronic conflict of the story, the failing marriage of the narrator. As described above, Act 1 introduces the reader to the conditions of the story, and it locates us in the lives of the principal characters. The unnamed narrator and his wife, Melissa, are at their son's birthday party. Joshua's a quirky, funny kid. Mitch Nauman is the single father of Bobby Nauman, Joshua's strange best friend. The narrator's wife is curling her toes around the front leg of Mitch Nauman's lawn chair. Our first hint at an extramarital intimacy. For a couple of reasons, I've determined that Act 1 ends when the narrator asks Melissa what that object in the sky is, and Melissa says, "My life is a mess." For one, we don't expect that response. The narrator has asked her about the blemish on the moon. Her snippet of dialogue is a surprise, a punch to the narrator's heart, and a punch to ours. The other thing that makes me feel this is the end of Act 1 is that the next section is the longest section of summary so far. It suggests a shift in time from the "my life is a mess" scene, and a shift to summary. And it's a general update on the apparent subject, the ever-descending ceiling. Act 2 is all about conflict and confrontation. Brockmeier offers us extended summaries and scenes that push forward the lines of suspense, the apparent subject, which is the descending ceiling, and the deeper subject, the collapsing marriage. This is the arena for real conflict and confrontation. The protagonist is going through all the stuff here, facing the complications, the confrontations, the disconnections. I feel that Act 2 ends after the biggest conflict of the story, when the narrator sees Melissa in the window of a bakery holding hands with Mitch Nauman across a table. Like Act 1, Act 2 ends with a short scene addressing the chronic conflict of the story and leads into a long update about the acute conflict, the descending ceiling. In Act 3, of course, both conflicts come crashing down. The ceiling has snapped trees and street lights and water towers, and the narrator and his family are lying flat on the ground, inches from the ceiling. On one side of Melissa is Mitch Nauman, and on the other side is the narrator, still reaching out in vain to his wife for some kind of tenderness. There's not much of a resolution there, but it certainly hints at both the acute and chronic conflicts of the story. As with all of the methods for studying structure in short stories, the goal is not to give you an exact template for how to use the 3-act structure to build your own story, nor is it to tell you that all stories have to be structured similarly. The point is to show you how to study a story for structure, in the hopes of growing your understanding of a common device used in story building. Studying this one story for its 3-act structure will not equip you for understanding structure completely for the rest of your writing career. Every opportunity you take to study a story to see if and how the 3-act structure is at play is another opportunity for you to deepen your understanding of how to structure your stories with intention and variety.